Welcome to the podcast, and today I'm talking to Emily Alston from Baxendale. Now, I met Emily a couple of weeks ago now, and she was telling me about Baxendale, and they've got a great story and a great history all around employee ownership. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to get Emily to share her story and a bit of a background about Baxendale before we leap into various types of employee share ownership. So welcome, Emily. Great to have you on the show.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm an advisor on employee ownership with a Specialising in employee ownership trusts, and I work for Baxendale Employee Ownership. But yes, we do have a very interesting backstory, and we do, as an organisation, we're advisors in employee ownership. We really have employee ownership in the DNA of our organisation. So our founder was Philip Baxendale. He's one of the pioneers of employee ownership, and Philip inherited the Baxi Boiler Company. So they manufactured boilers in Preston. It was a family business, and it was passed down to him through the family. He was one of a number of family owners of the business, and following his generation, there was no obvious family succession route for the business after that. Mm-hmm. During his time working in manufacturing, he got quite interested in employee ownership and also in the concept of kind of labour and capital, and why he is somebody who came from this Baxendale family could inherit all this wealth, whereas the people who were building the boilers had no rights to the profits that were created by the company. And he did quite a lot of research, and he visited sort of cooperatives and other employee-owned businesses. He got quite interested in the John Lewis model of trust ownership. And then he convinced the other family owners that a move into employee ownership was the best succession option for Baxi boilers. And that's what they did. And in 1983, they created the Baxi Partnership Trust, which is the trust that then owned Baxi boilers. And they had sewn up the ownership succession of the company for the future. And they actually had an Act of Parliament passed in order to, because there's an issue with trusts in perpetuity. So the Baxi Partnership Trust is, I think, the only employee ownership trust that has the Baxi Partnership Trust Act went through Parliament in order to ensure that the trust could go on in perpetuity. So that happened. Everything was great. Unfortunately, the story didn't end quite so well for the employees of Baxi Boilers, because although the ownership succession part of the story had been tied up, they had some issues with leadership succession, and they went through a number of CEOs in a short number of years, in the kind of 10 years following the move into employee ownership. And then they had quite a successful CEO, but he was very, very ambitious and overstretched the business with acquisitions. And unfortunately, Baxi Boilers was then had to be sold to, it was basically on its knees and had to be sold to a German company. But after the boiler company had left the business, the Baxi Partnership Trust still existed, and so did Philip Baxendale's enthusiasm for employee ownership as a way of doing business and as a succession option. So he repurposed the trust to support employee-owned businesses, and the trust still does that. And also the trust is the majority owner of a couple of advisory businesses, one that does some work around public sector mutuals, which is Baxendale Advisory, and Baxendale Employee Ownership, which is the employee-owned advisory company that I work for, that helps transition companies into employee ownership. And we also support businesses which are already employee-owned.
It's such a great backstory, isn't it? Like, what a hard lesson to learn, but at the same time, being a leader in employee ownership in this country, an act of Parliament to get things going in perpetuity, and that might be an interesting conversation to see, explore that one day as well. But the school of hard knocks, but that sets you up to really be experts in the field. So now Baxendale focuses on working with all organisations in helping them to become employee owned. So, and that's what you're focusing on today. Yeah, let's dig a bit deeper into that, shall we?
Yeah. So my personal background is I worked as a director of a business, an SME manufacturing business in Scotland, and our founder reached the point, and he wasn't at the point of retirement, but he was at the point that he had had enough of doing what he was doing currently, and he wanted to exit the business. But he didn't want to sell to a competitor. He knew in the area of manufacturing that we were in that a sale to a competitor would mean the company being broken up into its bits, and probably a large European manufacturer taking the drawings, all the employees losing their jobs. Didn't want that to happen. We weren't in a position to do a management buyout because we weren't able to raise the finance that we needed for that. And also, we could see that a management buyout would only perpetuate the problem. So this sort of weight of succession that our founder felt would just be passed on to the next generation. And what we really wanted to do was kind of tie up that succession question permanently. So the option that we found was to move the business into employee ownership, which at the time wasn't something that I knew very much about. But the EOT legislation was just about to be introduced at that point in 2013. So I learned a lot about it in a very short amount of time. And, you know, there are some parallels in some ways. You know, there are things that we did when we moved the business into employee ownership because we were very much pioneers with EOT, that I would do differently and that I would advise people to do differently now. You know, it's very much a learning on the job, but I got very quickly involved in the legislation around EOT, and very, very quickly developed an enthusiasm for this sort of, for EOT, for trust ownership, for employee ownership and collective ownership, because you can see both in the business that I worked in, but also as I started getting involved with other businesses that were already employee owned, the huge benefits, not only for employees, but also for the regions that businesses operate in, and for productivity, and also for exiting owners, because the owner of our business was able to exit on his own terms. He was able to preserve the independence and the legacy of the business, and off he went to go and pursue other projects, knowing that he'd protected the employees too, and also secured the legacy of the business that he'd built for the long term. So after I'd done that, I got involved with the Employee Ownership Association, which is a fantastic membership association for employee-owned businesses, and I sat on their board for a period of years. During this time, I was advising quite a lot of people about employee ownership, because people hear about what you've done and they want to know how you did it. So I began informally having meetings with people to tell them about employee ownership. And quite often people at my work would say, "What's Emily doing in the meeting room again? I think she's talking about EO, not about manufacturing." Yeah, I was offered the opportunity to join Baxendale Employee Ownership as an advisor. And my enthusiasm for employee ownership and the benefits to all the stakeholders, from owners, employees, customers, suppliers, all the way through, my enthusiasm for that, I knew that it was the right move for me to go and tell people about this and help people to do it.
Yeah, sounds like you really fell into doing something that you were already passionate about and already loved doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
What a fit. So it sounds like what you learned, and it was in Scotland, wasn't it, where you were employed before? Yeah, and Scotland is leading the way in really pushing and supporting the introduction of EOTs, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. There's a lot of support in Scotland for companies to move into employee ownership. The two hotspots for EO businesses at the moment are in Scotland and also in London and the southeast. And the drive in London has been led largely by a lot of professional services businesses, so architecture, landscape architects. There's quite a good fit for those businesses, and their traditional partnership structures are breaking down because people at the lower end of architecture no longer have the money to buy in to a partnership structure. So employee ownership is replacing the traditional partnership structure in architecture quite widely. But saying that, people say, "Oh, well, this employee ownership, it's just for professional services." But, you know, I came from a manufacturing background, and actually employee ownership is working across sectors now. And it's more the places where it maybe wouldn't fit are more about the sort of what the founder wants to get out of it not being a fit for the founder and the employee group, rather than the sector, because I think we've pretty much proven that it can work across sectors.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something that I've found in my working career as well, and that's just working with a lot of professional service companies or professional service businesses. I think the old model is broken. It's hundreds of years old, and the economy has moved on since that structure and left it behind. And this is employee ownership is a great way to work and benefit everyone in a common workplace or workforce. So
Yeah.
yeah, and I think what you also described is what we also see a lot of is business owners. Their business, they grow with their business over often a lifetime, but their whole career, 10, 15, 20 years. For smaller businesses, they're very passionate about it, aren't they? And they often know all the employees personally. They think of it as like families. They see themselves as providing for those families, and they're very attached to it. So when it comes time for them to start thinking about their next phase in life, their transition, they're very conscious about leaving that legacy and wanting to look after those people that have helped them the whole way. And as you say, in a traditional MBO type of arrangement, people need to have the money. That's not always going to work, but an employee share ownership scheme, can be a great succession option. It can also be what I think we've said in the past, and is it doesn't have to just wait until being a succession or an exit option. It can be a great way to energize and align people on that journey towards succession and option, not just 1, 2, or 3 years, but even 5, 10, 15 years. Ensure everyone's on the same page, singing from the same hymn sheet, pick a metaphor, but energize people, for the same goals and outcomes.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing at the moment a real increase. So most of the work that we do is still with exiting owners who are at the end of their careers, and they're looking at what's going to happen to their businesses next. And exactly as you say, money is always a motivation, but it's not always the only motivation. So some people are prepared to say, if I can get an amount that's enough, that's a fair price, actually these things like protecting my employees, having control over the process, the legacy of the business, protecting the independence of the business, these are on a par with me getting a fair price. These are important to me as well. So I'm not prepared myself to the highest bidder for that little bit extra. I'd like to take what's enough. But actually, like I say, we're finding these, there's a group of business founders and owners now who are not at that point of retirement, but they would like to realise some capital that's in their business. And they're interested, they want to continue working in the business, but they'd like to realise the capital for the point that they've got to, up to that point, which they feel is the point where they put in, a lot of extra as a founder. And they say that from that point on, they would like a separation between the ownership of the business and their leadership of the business. They want to continue to lead the business, but now it feels fairer for the ownership of the business to be in the hands of everybody. And we're finding an increase in that, and it's something which was quite a surprise to me, and it happens in quite a lot of digital businesses, digital and software, where traditionally you would expect people to be going for a trade sale and selling on for large sums of money, but actually these founders, just like the exiting founders in the SME businesses, are interested in protecting the independence of their business. And also they believe, because it's quite hard to retain staff in some of those industries, that there'll be better staff retention if they say, if you join this business, there's not going to be that sale point. This business its independence is secured for the long term. You join us, and there's a long term strategy, and they know this is employment for the long term, which for some people is a hugely important thing, and it's actually something that can be pretty rare at the moment. So.
Well, absolutely, and there's a lot of talk in the market about the Gen X and the Gen Y and how they feel about business, and there's some talk about whether they flip from one business to another, but what they're looking for is alignment and in purpose and cause, and what this seems to be doing, and what we're seeing also is that businesses are putting their money where their mouth is, so to speak. When they say people are our most important asset, it's not just rhetoric, it's demonstrating that people are their most important asset. And yeah, it is always a dilemma for a business owner, to think about their exit strategy, because they're going to leave one day whether they like it or not. And they want to be able to leave on their terms, when they want and how they want. So this helps them with the dilemma to balance getting the maximal return and leaving that legacy. So it seems like it's a beautiful solution all round, or what Covey might have called a win-win situation.
Yeah, and people who founded their own business are quite often quite interested in control and having control of the process, because that's one of the things that makes you a good entrepreneur, in the first place, is that needing to control all the small parts. And certainly in the case of a trade sale, that can be fairly comprehensively undermined during that process, because it can be quite a tough process to go through. Whereas in the employee ownership process, you've got control of not only the detail of making sure that your interests are protected and that you're getting the fair price that you expect, but also how long you're going to be repaid over. Is this, is it partly with external finance? Is it all going to be vendor financed? Can you take some money out on day one? All of those points, but also the structure of the business going forwards, and particularly where people have taken a lower price than they might have got otherwise, then they've got quite a lot of flexibility then to say, well, okay, I've given the business to the trust, I've sold it to the trust at a price which is a bit lower than maybe I would have got on the open market. But from now on, it's going to be run like this, and these are going to be some of the ways. So some of the culture and ethos that I've built, I'm going to make sure that's hardwired into the company going forwards. And that's the kind of protections around that legacy and culture that people have.
Well, absolutely. And what they're doing is having some influence over the future. And you've touched on something about, gradually stepping down and in various areas. And what we see over the years is that business owners, when they start a business, they often bundle up the three areas of ownership of, what are the benefits of ownership? Well, I get an income, I have some ownership, and I have control. And what we see so often is that, business owners bundle all those things together and treat them equally as one entity, if you like. But what we do is we go, well, let's separate those out. Income, what if you just get income for the work you do in the business, your role in the business? Equity is just your shareholding. What shareholding do you have in your business? And you can step down your shareholding different to what you can step down your role in the business. And control is just what structures, what governance structures, what board structures we have in place for controlling the strategy of your business. And if you go down an employee ownership scheme, you can, any exit strategy really, you can unbundle those three elements and treat them differently and identify a strategy for each one, depending on the needs of the owners. Is control more important to them? Is income more important to them? Or is equity, more important to them? So, it's a really interesting way to look at things when we break down the elements.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the difference between the two that get bundled up the most, ownership and leadership, and make it separating those. And one of the fantastic things that employee ownership delivers is separating the ownership from the leadership. So when you're looking for somebody to take over for the next generation, you're looking for the best person to lead the company, not the best person to lead the company who's also got enough money to buy the company. And by separating those two things, you get better leadership in the long term, because you don't just need the person who's going to be an okay leader, but he's got the deepest pockets. It's actually the person who's going to lead the company the best that can do it. And the other leadership and ownership point is, because a majority of these deals are vendor financed, there's a period of time after the deal is done where probably the existing owner continues working in the business while they're being paid out. So you've got still quite a lot of control at that point, but it gives you a fantastic window for letting go slowly, so you can let the new leadership team get comfortable in their positions while you're still there. And then there's a final point when you're paid out, which is perhaps years along the line, where you finally walk out of the door, but it hasn't happened in a way where there's a sudden cataclysmic change, which can work quite well for some people. Equally though, some people do want to walk out of the door on the day of completion, and some of those deals have worked really well, but you have to put the right protections in place for those people, because if you're not going to be working in the business, how are you going to make sure you're getting paid your vendor loan? Or you're going to have some protections around that to make sure that you get paid, and that you can step in if you feel that things are going wrong, and that you've got enough information about what's happening in the business if you've handed over to somebody else.
Yeah. And that sounds like you're talking specifically around an EOT.
Yeah, pretty much.
So why don't you, because not everyone will be familiar with what an EOT is and employee ownership. So that might be a nice little segue into an introduction, and we can move from there.
Yeah, sure. So employee ownership can mean a whole range of different things, and it's about some ownership being in the hands of the employees.
Yep.
Employee ownership, trust ownership. The John Lewis Partnership is the most famous example of a large business that's owned by a trust.
Yep.
But then in 2014, we had been doing this at Baxendale Employee Ownership. We've been moving businesses into employee ownership since the early 2000s. So during that period of time, we were using employee benefit trusts to do that. But in 2014, an employee ownership trust was introduced, which is a new kind of trust. And what happens is it's the trust that buys the shares in the business. And provided the trust has bought a majority share, so 51% or more, the shares can be sold into the trust free of capital gains tax. That tax benefit was put in place by the government because they accepted that ownership by employees is a good thing, but sometimes exiting owners have to accept a lower price in order to do that. So the capital gains tax exemption is there to kind of bridge some of that gap between the money that people might have got by selling their business on the open market and what they'll get when they sell into an employee ownership trust. So most of the deals are vendor financed. So the company will pay out of its profits, will pay off the loan over a period of time. So employees don't have to part with any money. And the shares of the business, the majority share, is held in the trust for the benefit of the employees. So you then have a trust board who will be in control of the ownership of the business, but you would still have an operational board just like in another company. So one of the big misconceptions about employee ownership is, how can I lead a company when the employees are in charge? Well, they're not in charge. Your business will still be run by its operational board as you would expect. Yep. You have a trust board, which is in charge of the shareholder rights, and sometimes has another role too around about protecting culture and an ethos of the business. If that's in some businesses, that's particularly important and can have been one of the drivers. That's not always the case though. Sometimes they're just there in a monitoring role, hold the board to account like shareholders would do. So yeah, that's basically how it's structured. There's another tax benefit too, which is the share in the profits. A share in the profits of up to £3,600 can be paid to the employees free of income tax each year. So there's a tax gain for both the employees and for the exiting owner.
Yeah, and I think one of the important distinctions that you just touched on briefly there that are worth exploring a bit is that the employees don't own the business. The trust owns the business, and it's what we were talking about earlier about breaking down and separating or unbundling income, ownership, and control. The trust is just an ownership, and it's not the management team. The roles for managing and leading the business are separate to the ownership, and that becomes a functional business model, and that's how we get longevity. I think the other thing that you touched on and was really interesting is that as business owners, because they've been attached to their business for so long, when it comes to exit or even succession strategy, it's as much about getting the business owners ready and prepared for the transition as it is getting the business ready and setting up the systems and processes and education for everyone else in the business and changing the culture. So in your experience, what sort of businesses are suitable or for employee ownership, or what changes need to be made into most businesses before they are suitable for employee ownership?
I think you want to look at succession, what people's goals are for their exit from the business. So, if it's not about sectors, like I said earlier, it's more about what the founder wants to get out of it, and it's about the structure of the business. And yes, there are some businesses like professional services businesses which are a very neat fit into employee ownership, but actually there's some other businesses where there's not usually that collaborative culture, where you can actually see a much bigger benefit from the move into employee ownership, because the changes, the increases in sharing information, the fact that people get a share in the profits and these things, create a kind of collaborative and more participative culture within the business, and you get a bigger kind of, there's like an employee ownership uplift where you suddenly see an increase in profits when the employees become owners. Well, in businesses that already have quite a collaborative model, you don't see that quite so much. Whereas in businesses where it is a change in culture, and obviously the legal paperwork on its own is not going to make a change in culture. You have to have a committed management team, and everybody needs to be behind, because it's beneficial ownership. People haven't got a share certificate in their hands, so you have to be prepared to make that feeling, that ownership, real for people, and to believe in it as an organization. But you can, in businesses which don't traditionally have those cultures, you can see a huge increase in kind of productivity and engagement and participation for employees. So I wouldn't say there was a sector that wasn't any good. I think you need to look at what a founder's drivers behind their exit are. So if somebody's looking to get all the money on day one, if you have maybe somebody who's exiting their business and they're in their 80s, then probably an vendor financed employee ownership deal is not going to be for them. They're going to need that money now. They probably want to go and find somebody who's going to buy their business so that they can get the money as quickly as possible. Equally, if you've got somebody who's interested in a sale to the highest bidder, or a group of shareholders who are into sort of maximizing what their return's going to be when the business is sold, then it's probably not for them either, because arguably you're going to get a fair price if your business is profitable, and you can balance that. There's a balance, which is how much money is enough for you, how much the business can pay out, and how long you and the employees are willing to wait to reach the point that you're paid off, to reach the end of the earn-out period. And if you can balance those things, then perhaps you can get enough money to satisfy that. But those are the businesses that it probably wouldn't suit so well. Other businesses, I think, genuinely, if people are interested in protecting the independence and protecting legacy and protecting the interests of their employees, there's not a sector that it's not appropriate to. It's just understanding what your goals are. And continuity is a huge one. People who are interested in continuity, that's a major benefit, not just for the owners, but for the employees as well. It can sometimes be quite a hard sell to employees. It's that the brilliant thing that's happening is everything's going to stay the same. But actually, if you have an employee or a number of employees who've been through a trade sale before, there can be quite a negative fallout for employees after that. Yeah. And quite often that's actually a surprisingly big selling point to employees. So it's on the most basic level for employees. That's the biggest selling point is, there's this continuity. But obviously, the more involved in the employee-owned sort of structure that the business becomes, there are a lot of other benefits for employees. Profit share on a huge, purely financial basis, but also participation and greater transparency, people understanding where the business is at, which then allows people to make better decisions. So you get this kind of uplift in productivity, and the business performs better. Businesses tend to get rooted in the regions that they were founded, which can be important to some people, and also supports regional economies.
Okay. And what's your experience about the employees themselves when they make the switch to an employee ownership? What's in it for them? What's the motivator? You touched on some tax benefits, but they're aligned to the bigger picture. What's your experience around that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. One of the most important things is managing expectations around this, because it is very good for protecting continuity in businesses. So if people really like their job, then they're going to be on board with this, because this is what's going to allow you to carry on after the founder or the seller exits. This is what's going to allow you to carry on doing the job that you love into the future and tie up that succession issue that means there's not going to be a trade sale further along the line, which is, could have a negative impact on that. So there's that, but then there's also on the trust board. Usually you've got you don't have to, but usually there's some employee involvement on the trust board, which means that the employees have got a voice at ownership level. Yeah. It's quite important to distinguish between what's an employment right. So everybody's employment rights and contracts of employment will stay the same. You know, you're still going to work to do the same job you were going to work to do yesterday. But normally there is an employee voice at ownership level, which means that there is the employees can guide the direction of the business, or at least have a lot more information about the direction and vision and strategy of the business that they're working in, and have an entitlement to that as beneficial owners. So that's great. And then if people really embrace the employee-owned thing, there is lots of opportunities for greater participation in like strategy and vision, but also just, you know, at ground level, make, you know, greater amounts of decision making. But the amount of involvement that the employees have really depends on the business and the way that it's structured. For some businesses, they want to give a lot of participation and a lot of involvement to employees as part of the move. For other people, it's really just about tying up the continuity part, tying up independence and legacy, and then saying, you know, you've got the right now to continue doing the job that you love for as long as you want to do it. But you do have to manage expectations and say to people, you know, if you didn't like your job the day before employee ownership, you're not going to like it the day after either, because this is a continuity sell, you know, it's not a huge upsell.
And you're still working with the same people.
Exactly, yes.
Before, yeah. So you've talked about a whole lot of good things, and we've discussed all the benefits and positives of employee ownership. What could possibly go wrong?
There is an important point about managing people's expectations at the start of the process. So if you have a big fanfare, you're all going to become owners. People can interpret that whichever way they want. It's important to understand what beneficial ownership is. I should say that, you know, some of these employee-owned schemes do have some direct share ownership as well, and we do quite a lot of hybrid schemes too, where people have direct share ownership. But, you know what it is you're going to deliver to people and manage expectations. I think there can be a degree of cynicism, particularly during the earn-out period, where, you know, you've been given this employee ownership thing, but all the profits of the business are still going to pay out an exiting owner, so you're not seeing any share of the profits yet. So businesses can be celebrating profitable years, and people can feel like, well, we're owners now, we should be seeing some of that. But during that earn-out period, it's all going to the exiting owners, and you have to be really straight up with people about that from the beginning, so people understand, you know, this is the period of the earn-out, provided we hit this profit, because if we don't, then the earn-out period is going to be longer. And so that people really understand that, and they're working towards that kind of financial freedom day that's going to come further along the line, so that they don't feel that they're working for nothing during the earn-out period, because that sort of cynicism, all the money's going to that guy. And that can be a problem when owners leave as well. If the owners are still working in the business during the earn-out, people can still see the benefit that they're creating and the income that they're creating for the business, you know, so that can make that a little easier. And I've got to go back to the Baxendale story too. And the other thing that can go wrong is you've tied up the ownership succession, but have you looked properly at leadership succession and where that leadership journey is going to go? Because if you've got somebody who comes in who doesn't understand employee ownership, then things can start to go wrong. And luckily, as the employee-owned sector grows and this becomes, you know, more of a usual thing for people to do, there's a lot of people out there who do understand EO and want to lead EO businesses. But yeah, I mean, the thing with an EO business is normally there's not a big trade sale at the end. This is about, you know, securing things for the long term. So you've got to look for leaders who've got that long-term that long-term attitude and who understand what's going on here. You know, this isn't about building for a sale.
You basically, there's a warning there. Know what you're getting into. You know, there's a commercial exit strategy, but there's also a cultural strategy. And those businesses that open up and have, I think you mentioned transparency around strategy and naturally finances as well. Yeah, I know historically there's a lot of business owners who are really concerned about sharing finances with employees. There's a fear around that. You know, what if they find out what I'm earning? You know, whether that's a lot or not. And you know, so I think if I'm right, what you're suggesting is that you've seen it work best when the culture is open and everyone, you know, there's transparency there of what's happening.
And there's incredible benefits if you can go down that route. And it's not about sharing what people earn, because nobody will, that's people's private business. But sharing the performance of the company, even when it's bad, can be a big hurdle for people. But actually, if you share poor performance with people, then they will make better decisions for you. So if you don't share poor performance with people, then they'll just carry on spending money like they spent money before. They'll carry on making decisions in their working day in the way that they did, when they thought things were on their uppers. Whereas if you share poor performance with people, people will find ways. No, actually, I'm not going to do that because that's not the right thing to do just now, or I'm going to ask again about that. And people will find ways to save money if they know that performance is poor. And you're giving people the ability to make better decisions in their job roles from the bottom to the top. Whereas if you don't share that information with people have only got their own assumptions to base things on.
And when someone's making an assumption, what's the chance that they're going to arrive at the assumption that you want them to arrive at? It's
unlikely.
Pretty low, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Emily, why don't we wrap it up, and why don't you leave the listeners with your top tip or top advice or gotcha based on what you've learned about working with employee share ownership?
What I would say for people who are looking at an exit for their business is that employee ownership is not for everyone, but it's definitely worth a second look. And so that would be my tip for the top. I'd say, don't rule it out. Have a look into it. Maybe it's not for you, but and we definitely wouldn't advise that it's for everybody, but it's definitely worth a second look.
Yeah, definitely one of the options we should be looking at. Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a great tip. Hey, thanks for sharing with us today, Emily. Some fantastic insights there and experiences, and especially linking it back to, I guess, the Baxendale story and your personal experience as well. Great chatting to you today.
Yeah, lovely to talk to you.
All the best. Cheers.
Okay.